All right, so let's dive into one of the most profound and maybe one of the most misunderstood transformations in a human life, adolescence. And I'm going to ask you to just forget everything you think you know about it because we're not going to talk about chaos today. No, we're going to look at it as a deliberate and honestly, a brilliant period of rewiring. You know, for over a century, our whole view of teenagers has pretty much been dominated by this one idea. It was coined way back in 1904 by a psychologist named G. Stanley Hall, and he called it storm and stress. And you know exactly what this looks like, right? It's that classic image of the moody, rebellious teen, a turbulent time that's all about raging hormones and just something you have to survive. And believe it or not, for the longest time, that was pretty much the entire story.
But here's the thing. What if that's the wrong metaphor entirely? What if this whole period isn't some destructive storm we just have to get through? What if it's actually more like a meticulous, really purposeful construction project? You know, a time of profound architectural change, where the very foundations of the adult self are being built. That's the lens we're going to be using today.
Okay, so our architectural tour kicks off with Pillar 1, which we're calling the biological alien. And we're starting from the inside out, looking at the radical renovations happening in the hardware, in the adolescent brain itself. And for a while, it can honestly make them feel almost like a visitor in their own body. So the key blueprint for this whole renovation is something called the dual systems model. And this is super important. It's not about the brain being broken or deficient in some way. Not at all. It's about a temporary and actually a very important imbalance. You've got two crucial systems developing at the same time, but they're doing it at completely different speeds.
Okay, the easiest way to picture this is with a car analogy. Think of it like this. Puberty comes along and just slams the gas pedal on what's called the socio-emotional system. This is the brain's engine, right? It drives reward-seeking, emotional intensity, social connection, the whole shebang. It gets totally supercharged. But at the exact same time, the cognitive control system, that's the brain's brakes up in the prefrontal cortex, it's maturing way more slowly, very methodically. And that's the part responsible for planning and impulse control. So yeah, for a few years, you literally have a sports car engine with bicycle brakes. And that gap, that's what this is all about. The drive for rewards, for new feelings, for social approval, it's just peaking. But at the same time, the ability to think through consequences and slam on the brakes, that's still under construction. And I gotta say it again, this imbalance isn't a flaw, it's a feature. It's the exact thing that pushes a teenager out into the world to explore, to take some risks, and to figure out who they are. So the big question is, how does this newly rewired brain actually operate out in the world? Well, that brings us to Pillar 2, the anthropological weaver. See, with this brand new internal hardware, the teenager's main job is to take all the different threads from their culture, their family, their experiences, and weave them all together into a solid identity. You've probably heard the term for this before. The great psychoanalyst Erik Erikson, he called it the identity crisis. He saw this whole period as basically a struggle between finding a stable sense of self, achieving an identity, and this feeling of just being lost or confused about your role in the world. And let's be clear, this isn't just teenage angst. It's a fundamental developmental challenge everyone has to go through. So building on Erikson's work, a researcher named James Marcia figured out there are basically four main paths teens can take on this journey. You've got diffusion, that's when they're not really thinking about it yet. Then there's foreclosure, which is when they adopt an identity, usually from their parents, without really exploring for themselves. Then you have moratorium, and this is a big one. It's that active period of trying on different hats, seeing what fits. And finally, if all goes well, some reach identity achievement, where they make a real commitment after all that exploration. But here's the thing. The way this identity weaving happens has changed a lot. I mean, think about it. In a lot of traditional societies, this social adolescence was pretty short, maybe a few years. And it was marked by these really clear rites of passage. And it all happened in small, mixed-age groups. Now, flash forward to today. It's a much longer, way more ambiguous journey, right? It can last for 10 years or more, ending with something like graduation, and it's all navigated inside these huge peer groups where everyone's the exact same age. The entire environment for building an identity has been completely transformed. And that brings us perfectly to our third and final pillar, the digital lens. Because what happens when you take that ancient biological drama from Pillar 1 and that timeless social quest for identity from Pillar 2,
and you put it all on the newest, biggest, most public stage imaginable.
Okay, so let's go back to pillar 1 for a second. Remember that rewired brain? That accelerator pedal that's just floored for social rewards? Well, neuroscience shows us that this creates a brain that is exquisitely sensitive to what other people think, especially what their peers think. It's tuned into evaluation and it is terrified of social rejection.
So, how sensitive are we talking about? Well, researchers have this really clever and kind of mean online game called Cyberball. Here's how it works. You think you're tossing a virtual ball with two other players, but they're actually just controlled by a computer. And then all of a sudden, the computer players just stop tossing the ball to you. They exclude you. And what they found is that adolescents show way more real, measurable distress than adults do. To their brain, getting left out of a completely meaningless online game feels incredibly personal and really threatening.
Okay, so now let's take that highly sensitive brain and drop it right into our modern environment, an environment of almost total digital immersion. And get this, even way back in 2009, this is before smartphones were everywhere, American teens were already spending more than 7.5 hours a day with media. That's a full-time job.
And we're not just talking about passively watching stuff. No, this is constant, active interaction. By 2014, the average teen in the UK was sending 137 texts a week. And you have to understand, this constant stream of back and forth isn't a distraction from their social life. For a lot of them, this is their social life. It's the arena where the high stakes of that cyberball experiment play out, not just once, but hundreds of times every single week. So naturally, this absolute explosion of digital life has led to a lot of fear. You see the headlines all the time, right? They're screaming about damaged brains and lost childhoods. Sociologists actually have a name for this. They call it a moral panic. It's when all our anxieties about some new, poorly understood thing get totally sensationalized by the media. I mean, it happened with rock and roll, it happened with video games, and, yep, now it's happening with social media. But there's another way to look at this. A researcher named Dana Boyd has this really powerful counter-narrative. She argues that as teens' physical freedom has gotten more and more restricted, by worried parents, these networked publics have basically become the new town square. She says it's not an addiction to technology, it's an addiction to each other. For her, social media has become this vital release valve. It's just the place where they hang out, where they work through all those identity struggles, and where they can simply be with their friends.
So, what happens when you put all three of these pillars together? You take this rewired brain, you add this long drawn-out search for identity, and you place it all in this brand new digital landscape. Well, what you get is the architecture of the modern transition to adulthood. In fact, a sociologist named Jeffrey Arnett argues that all these forces combined have actually created a whole new stage of life. He calls it emerging adulthood. You know this feeling. It's that period from about 18 to 25 where you don't feel like a teenager anymore, but you definitely don't feel like a full-on adult either. You're just in between. And this stage exists for one simple reason. The work of adolescence just takes a lot longer now.
And really, this stage is just a direct extension of that whole construction project we've been talking about. It's an age of intense identity exploration, especially around love and work. That's the weaver still trying out different threads. It's often defined by instability, changing jobs, moving apartments, shifting relationships, all as the search continues. It's basically the modern version of that moratorium phase, but it's a prolonged one. It's this extra time to figure out who you are before the concrete of full adulthood really sets. And that brings us all the way back to where we started, back to our central idea. If adolescence isn't some random storm of stress, but instead it's a predictable, purposeful, and totally vital process of construction, well, then that changes everything, doesn't it? It suggests that all the turmoil we see isn't the point. The building is the point. And so it leaves us with this one big question. How can we, as a society, stop just trying to ride out the storm and start becoming better, more supportive architects for the next generation?